We have a panel discussion up for you next, and this is going to be a good one. Got a lot of exciting people here, thankfully joining us. I want to hand over the reins to our very own head of custom engineering, Georg Traar. He will intro and take it away in terms of moderating the panelists we have upcoming for you. Georg, thanks so much. Over to you.
Thanks, Simon. So yeah, today is all about changing from an enterprise license to go fully open source again, to use the Apache 2 license. I hope that all our panelists already joined. We have today a good mixture of speakers, from engineers to working more on the legal side to working on the product side. Just to give you all an update, we want to keep that open. Our speakers are basically briefed to give their own opinion and stay within the code of conduct, but we didn't brief them in any way to favor CrateDB. So this should really be an open discussion about open source software. Let me introduce our four speakers. First, we have BG Haggerty. BG is the founder of Deflate.io. He's also a board member of the Open Source Mental Illness Corporation and a senior developer advocate at Mattermost. He also organizes various developer events, including the DevOps Days in Buffalo, the Code Days, Elixir Days, and others. Additionally, BJ is a developer, writer, speaker, and musician. He is known to travel the world and speaking about programming and the way people interact and think. He also worked at Crate and basically helped us build the developer relations team.
So I'm Amanda Brock. I'm CEO of Open UK. I was a tech lawyer for 25 years, set up and ran the legal team at Canonical for 5 years, and I've worked in and around open source for over a decade. I'm now the CEO at Open UK, which is the organization for the business of open in the UK. Really looking forward to the conversation today.
So next we have Per.
Hi, my name is Per. I have a background in open source software, being part of Umbraco for 10 years, which is a open source content management system on the Microsoft platform. They're doing product engineering and strategy. And I'm currently head of product security at Zalando, working with privacy, security, and compliance, also in regards to open source.
All right, thank you. And Natalie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Vlatko. I look after the open source program officer at Wayfair. Been at Wayfair for a bit over 3 years, and for those who may not know Wayfair, it's a similar space to Zalando in retail, focusing on the home furniture space. Specifically with Wayfair, our open source journey is rather new, so this hopefully will be an interesting perspective in terms of how we're focusing on our path forward on the open source journey with a company as big as ours. My background academically is actually in archaeology and Egyptology. Tech is my plan B career, I would say, but it's something that really allows me to put a great spin on things like a historical context and a lot of technical kind of spaces that I'm working in. So really great to be here. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for joining. So as I said, today is really about changing the license from CrateDB from an enterprise licensing model to an open source model to switching to Apache 2. We have recently seen some other movements on the market, especially as also already mentioned today about Elasticsearch. I would be really interested. In the introduction of this change for Elasticsearch, they mentioned that reasons for that was basically legal reasons, that Elasticsearch couldn't go against the big cloud providers. I want to ask you, Amanda, how do you see that topic from a legal reason? Is this really a problem for open source software, or do you think there are other ways to cope with that?
So just to be clear, you're asking me about Elastic, I know, but the legal reasons are Elastics, you're saying?
Elastic reasoned this change from an open source version to an enterprise version by saying that they can't compete with these big cloud providers, with Microsoft and Amazon.
Yeah. So I think I can, if I've got a couple of minutes while you guys just fix your technical things, I can talk a little bit about what happened there. So there was a really interesting piece in the press that if this is an area you want to know about, or if you're trying to run an open source business and you want to understand revenue models, I suggest you read the New York Times piece from November, December 2019. And in that piece, they talked about strip mining. And that's a term that's used where the large cloud companies are alleged to be using others' code without giving anything back. So they're stripping out the value, taking the benefit and not sharing that. And I guess that is something that we've seen for over a decade. It's something that was identified at the early stages of cloud and platform development. And really, it's something that I think when we're looking at revenue and business models now, we should be taking into account. But actually, the cloud companies, when it comes to open source, are doing nothing wrong, because when you share your code on an open source basis, you're allowing other people to use it. And one of the things that the open source definition does is it says very clearly that you can't have discrimination on field of use. So we often see people get confused because you have, within the Creative Commons suite of licensing, the right to identify non-commercial and only to share non-code things on a Creative Commons basis for non-commercial usage. But then when we get back to software and to open source, it's counterintuitive and it's not possible. And I think that confusion has impacted a lot of people early stage when they're thinking about their businesses, or they've just not fully thought it through maybe. So when I left Canonical, I spent a couple of years advising startups, and they used to come into me and they all wanted to open source. You know, I'd probably been the lawyer in the biggest open source company in Europe, so why else would you come and see me? And frankly, I used to put people off because they hadn't sorted out their revenue model. And they'd come in and they'd talk about it, and I'd say, okay, that's all great, sounds really exciting. What if you go and you build this and you don't make any money? And they'd say, oh. What if somebody else code and they use your code and they're able to do it in a way that allows you to make very little, but they get to make a lot? And that whole piece around open source is something that you have to understand. That collaborative sharing model is absolutely critical to open source. But one thing that open source is not, and I know the other panelists are probably going to jump in shortly and start to talk about their experiences, one thing that it is not is a business model. It was never designed to be that. So when you share an open, you've got to work out how you're going to generate revenue before you do it, if that's your goal. And in our prep for these panels, something that we talked a lot about was the big infrastructure projects and how great open works in that sort of space. And I know we'll come back to that later. And just to sort of wrap up on the Elastic piece, what Elastic did after all of this discussion with AWS and the other big cloud providers is make a decision to shift away from open source and to shift from open source to the SSPL. Now, the SSPL is very definitely proprietary. I can say that not just because I think that, but because the OSI were pushed so hard on this that they had to come out and say it and make a public statement. So what we have to understand is that when something's going to be open source, to use that, to benefit from it, to get all the advantages on the marketing side, on the adoption side, the ubiquity side, that you have to also understand that you are distributing on an OSI approved license, or you can't call it open source. So hopefully that sets the scene a little bit for the other speakers, and I'll sort of back off and let them talk more about it.
Well, thanks a lot. Maybe Per, you already also worked on an open source project, and quite a large open source project on the .NET-based platform for content management. What is you also worked there on the business model? How do you see that point of view with open source and business models, as Amanda noted?
Yeah, I think as Amanda rightfully pointed out, like open source is not a guarantee for a business model. And I think over the 10 years, we evolved the company. Our business model also changed like 15 to 20 times, I guess, depending on the state of the company. We had various streams of income, but the software itself was never the income stream for us. We never licensed it as like commercial enterprise software, but had various other complementary income streams instead. And that was our focus from the beginning, because I think when you are a business that produces open source software, you have to find a model that accommodates both what you want to do as a business, how you want to make money, but also what accommodates the community, so that people can stay engaged and you don't have a conflict of interest between you developing feature you want to sell versus features that the community contributes because they want them, and then you end up selling them. But also in the end, you also have to have a value offering for the actual paying customers. And there's these three parties in this whole system, and you need to find a model that accommodates. And for us, it changed over the years. We started out just doing consulting services next to the software. We ended up doing training and partner programs, and ended up like with a SaaS model, not selling the software as a model, but more handling the complexity of how do you actually deploy content on a content management system, which is an entirely different problem. But it has nothing to do with the core functionality of what we actually did in the software itself. So the topic of open source software and the business model was for us very separate. And it's a hard complexity to manage. I would say it's easier to be a non-open source software company than to be an open source company.
All right. BJ, what is your view on that question?
Yeah, I agree with what both Amanda and Per said. I think there's a juxtaposition of the concept of open source and the concept of, how we work in a capitalist society to build revenue, to sell the things that people want and the software that people need and things like that. It's interesting. I mean, from the perspective of Mattermost, where I'm working now, they had no intention, like they are an open source company, but at the same time, they had no intention of ever not having a revenue model. So similar to what Amanda was saying, like the whole plan was, yes, we're going to make money off of this chat platform. And the way that they decided to do that was very similar to Crate, in that they said, there's going to be certain features that we'll put behind a paywall that make more sense for a large enterprise. And then anyone who's not a large enterprise, they can have this for free, and add integrations and add plugins as they see fit. So I think that's become the more common model. I think the issue that a lot of people have with open source, especially as it's understood in kind of that Silicon Valley, San Francisco startup world, is they think open source is free. I can use it as I want, and we'll call ourselves an open source company because we're using an open source programming language, or we're using some open source tooling, and therefore we're an open source company. But as Amanda very clearly pointed out, that doesn't make you open source. That makes you a user or a consumer of open source. And I think that's where a lot of the difficulty in understanding comes, especially in that whole VC startup, fast-paced world. It's oh, we're using Python and therefore we're definitely an open source company. It's like, are you contributing to Python? Are you building actual Python core stuff that you're giving back to the community? In what way are you an open source company, other than just being a consumer of open source? And I think that's a key differentiation that I think a lot of people miss. Open source is a great thing, and it's there for everybody to use it. But at the same time, it's really necessary to zero on in what makes an open source company, what makes an open core company, what makes a company that embraces and extends open source. And those are three very different things.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I see that also that way. Natalie, anything from your side to add on top of that? You actively contribute, not only contributing, but actually working at Wayfair to make your engineering teams use more open source software. How do you see that topic? What BJ just talked us about. I think I have to unmute you. Sorry.
Great, thank you. Yes, Wayfair is certainly what PJ just described, which is a consumer of open source. Absolutely, our business model is clearly not open source first, but at the same time, what Wayfair has recognized is that as our overall technical engineering organization gets bigger and our desire to actually innovate further in that space grows to support our business model, we need to actually be investing in open outside of anything that is first monetarily first, but actually investing with time of our engineers, investing in contributing back, and also investing in being able to think a little differently than what we have traditionally in terms of build versus buy, and buy being actually use open source in the first place. So previously at Wayfair, we would often say, let's build something ourselves, let's try and innovate this way, let's give our engineers the opportunities to think outside the box and build products that are really impactful for our customers and overall users. And now we are definitely shifting to, is there something out there on the market in open source world that is hopefully maybe 70 to 80% of our use case of what we can use, and then we can contribute back that 20%, save ourselves that time of building from scratch in the first place, and actually being able to reap the benefits that open source provides in being able to have thinkers outside of our technical space, our Wayfair walls, actually helping us contribute back and using the software that is actually helping our actual business model, not the open source side of things. So that's something that we're journey-wise is definitely rather new in the sense of actually pushing an open source program office to help with the support of that. But at the same time, small contributions, specifically from our infrastructure folks, have been streaming in quite frequently for the last, let's say, 10 or so years of the 17 years that we've been around. So it's not that open source is completely like new for Wayfair, but actually how we're approaching what our role in the larger community is. And so being such a big company, we have so much to give since we use so much already. And we're only now, I would say, clicking onto the fact that we should be giving back a lot more than what we have taken in the past.
I think I've been unmuted so that I can chat to the other speakers, and I'm just picking up on a couple of things that have been said there, Natalie and PJ in particular. I think what Natalie's talking about is a classical journey into open source where you start as a user, you then go through that journey. In some cases it's inner source, in some cases it's straightforward use, build your confidence and become a contributor. And we're seeing that beyond the tech sector and mass adoption. And it sort of runs through sectors. If you follow Linux Foundation, you can watch how it happens. So you can see things like automotive grade Linux, bring the automotive sector in, software defined networking and other activities around the mobile space, bringing the MNOs in. You can just watch it go sector by sector. In the UK, we're seeing a lot now, as well as in mainstream where it's sitting on the cloud. We're seeing specific adoption around healthcare, around financial services. Obviously, we've got retail people here, you know, so it's obviously massive in that. But going back to what PJ said, you have this issue, and I found it interesting in the last month on discussions like this, and I'd really love to hear what Per and Natalie think about this. Americans keep raising the VC issue, and they keep raising this issue. So I had a heated conversation last week on a cloud podcast where I was told that Deloitte were spreading the story that open source is going to change, and they're going to change the licensing to allow exclusion of commercial use. Now, that's never going to happen with the OSI, so we should be really clear on that. What could happen is we could create something different, and that's something different. I've heard Matt Acey and Microsoft talk about it as shareware. Was it shareware they use? I call it public code, where you put your code public, but you don't actually make it open. So you don't give all the benefits of open, all the modification rights, all the contribution rights, all the building a community and doing the stuff that really makes open what open is. They don't do that. And what I've been hearing, PJ, is what you've just said, which is that this problem is coming from a few VCs in the Bay Area who are investing in open companies, who are then really driving founders hard for return, and who are not happy that the licensing model around open source, which doesn't charge a royalty for open source software, although you could if you wanted to, but it's sort of counterintuitive, that isn't allowing them to generate enough money. And I can say from my experience, I don't know what anybody else thinks, but being in an open source company, it is really quite difficult to make money when you give your core product away. It's not easy. You've got to work really hard, and you've got to know what you're doing and think it through. But I'd be really interested on Per and Natalie, whether you agree with PJ and what we're hearing about it.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Just raise your hand if you, yeah, perfect.
Okay, I understand you have this need for a bit more strict muting right now. I think the whole conversation around tech companies is part of this problem. I don't think it only applies to open source companies. Actually, I think our vision of a tech company always growing very large, getting venture capital, and then taking over the world is kind of the story we always tell ourselves. That's how tech companies are supposed to grow, and it has to like go from 0 to $1 billion in 3 years. And I think the story we also tell ourselves in the open source side of things is that story as well. And we very much celebrate all the acquisitions, like, oh, Red Hat was a success because it got bought by IBM. So in my view, it's not a success to actually be acquired. I think there needs to be another vision for success for open source companies. It doesn't have to be venture capital. It doesn't have to be acquired by an old tech company. That is not, to me, interesting, and I don't think it's a sign of success, actually. So I totally agree with you, Amanda. I think it is a part of the problem, this driving these companies toward a more rapid way of making money, and it does introduce all these problems.
Yeah, I agree. I think what's interesting is this. I saw this in another forum that I frequent a lot. This idea of this culture of immediacy around open source. That apparently, as soon as something is open source, there's this expectation that the innovation of this work is actually going to skyrocket and be so quick and so amazing. I think that's actually an anti-pattern of open source specifically. And what I find with the VC specifically is that drive is pushing this pressure that open source is supposed to deliver something that is antithetical to what it actually represents, which is innovation coming from a community which is comprised of humans who are themselves interesting, complex beings, and time is something that actually affects us all rather differently. So I think what's interesting there is that for a company like Wayfair, for us, the benefits around open source, we know it's actually going to be a bit of a longer slog. We don't think we're going to see returns in 6 months, in 12 months. It is going to take time. And that over that time, we're going to see that we're going to hopefully attract a lot more senior engineers who want to join and do open source with us. We're going to see that we're able to make space for ourselves to speak about the products that we care about and be in those forums eventually. And we're hopefully going to see our own technical credibility go up. So those things are all things that are going to take quite a lot of time. And with VCs pushing on this idea that, 0 to several million in, let's say, 3 years, that is not something that that Wayfair on the open source side of things at all expects. And so what's great with us is that we do have the backing of ourselves, that we don't have to actually play that time game, and we can invest for the long run, and specifically invest in the communities that are going to take the time to hopefully reap the benefits that we're choosing to invest in for that purpose.
I think Amanda was next, raising hand.
Just quickly, a couple of things around that value point. I think it's really interesting what you're both saying. And traditionally, there's been a problem around the way VCs value companies and patenting, and it really not sitting well with open source. And that's one that we've been talking about for a while. But I think you're right, Natalia, when we look at the pace that people are expecting to achieve the uptake of their products and the revenue streams that you're talking about there, it's not sustainable. Sorry, and what we're looking at more and more is how to bring sustainability to the heart of all of this. And I think Per's point on value is fundamental, and it's something that we're actually trying to look more at in the UK, is how do we look at value? What is the value in open source?
All right, thank you. PG.
I had a very similar thought there to what Amanda shared and what both Per and Natalia shared, and it's kind of the interesting part is I think that VC firms especially seems to equate things with speed, and with open source it's about investing over time. So it's not, it's not something that you're going to see an immediate return on. I think that when Natalia's saying they're doing it Wayfair is kind of a great example of saying, listen, so we're going to build a product, and we know we're using open source, and we're going to give back eventually, maybe not right away, but eventually. And there's that promise there. And I've even worked with, with venture firms that are like, we're cool with you using open source, and we're cool with you giving a certain percentage back to open source, as long as it doesn't affect the hockey stick growth that we're looking for, which is kind of like, a huge nightmare to them. They need that hockey stick growth. They want their money back, which is understandable. They're giving you a bunch of money. They'd like their money back. But it kind of, there's a parallel there with open source where you're taking a lot for free. You're taking a programming language, you're taking tools, and you're taking that for free. At some point, you're kind of responsible to give it back. I use this analogy a lot, and I know that when we were talking before we did the panel, open source is free like a puppy is free. And I know that Amanda pointed out that right now with the pandemic, no puppies are free. All puppies are extremely expensive. But even if you look in the newspaper classified ads and you find a free puppy, that's not free. Like, you have so much work you need to do. It's a little bit different with open source, and the fact that you can bring the puppy home and play with the puppy, and maybe the puppy grows a little bit before you are actually responsible for the feeding and caring of this puppy. But the puppy's going to want to eat. The puppy's going to have its own demands. With the VC side of things, they kind of look at it as, well, that's great. Use as much of that puppy as you possibly can. I'm going to stretch this metaphor as long as I possibly can. But use that puppy as long as you can. Maybe it's a full guard dog before you actually decide to give back to it. But make sure I get my dog food that I gave to you for that puppy before you start feeding everybody else. And that's like the mythology of it. They think that open source is just another tool to use, like, picking up a platform as a service, or it's just something else you put in your hat and you say, okay, cool, we got this, we're done, we don't need to worry about it ever again. And great, it's free, but we need to break VCs away from the idea that it's free. And we're talking about VCs. It's not just VCs. There's lots of company founders that believe that open source is a leveraging tool or a good way to get people. When I was coming up as a developer in the Ruby community, there were lots of startups that loved Ruby because it was free and super easy to use. That ended up biting them later when they realized if you don't take care of the ecosystem, it tends to degrade. And that's true of every open source project I've ever worked with. If you don't take care of the community is not going to take care of you. And that realization needs to happen, I think, with a lot of the people who are leading the money-backed ventures and things like that, and even the startup founders.
Oh, thanks. Just a small note, I will ask to unmute you all, and you can just join the conversation whenever you feel like. I think there are not that many background noises anyway. But speaking about community, so open source projects often have this you would always think about about community when you're talking about open source projects as well, in the same sentence, because an open source project lives from the community in some regards. I mean, some open source projects are really maintained by single persons as well, but they are living from the contributions in terms of insights, what maybe use of that projects want. Do you see that as an advantage of open source projects in general, or do you think there's also a movement in commercialized products that there might also be a community? And just a little thing to add there, you are all users of open source software. Do you see it as an advantage that there might be a bigger community around open source software compared to enterprise solutions? Natalie, please.
Yeah, so I think it's both sides. I think it's an advantage and a disadvantage. The interesting disadvantage being that, as we saw with the amount of gate crashes, there are some people who don't play by the rules, and don't follow your codes of conduct and so on. And so the community is made up of humans that are sometimes not always going to play by the standard set. But at the same time, what is the advantage of the community, in my opinion, is being able to get those opinions that are outside of the space that you're working in, outside of, let's say, the certain technical limitations you may be held to, outside of the things that you've experienced, and also maybe outside of your comfort zone. I think what I find really interesting about communities that we've worked with Wayfair is the interesting communication differences that we have. And again, talking about this idea of urgency and how we in Wayfair want to iterate really, in small chunks so that we're delivering quite frequently, have a lot of constant communication so that folks know what's going on. But seeing a PR linger for a few days in an open source project, people start to worry, and you have to kind of chat with them and say, this community, they're not trying to jump on issues straight away. They're giving space for many of the community to maybe have a look and see what this issue is, chat about it, actually all engage with the certain PR that's come in, for example. And so that interesting difference has actually meant that we at Wayfair have learned to take some of that on internally for us to do a lot in our inner sourcing work, where we actually want to hear opinions rather than quickly solving the problem. And so understanding then what is the best way to solve something and actually taking that time. So on the community front, for us, it's definitely, we're trying to choose to perceive it as an advantage because of what we've already taken as great ways to then add to our own engineering culture internally. And then hopefully it's my absolute mission to kind of have open source workflow and Wayfair workflow to not actually be very different at all. And so when you're joining Wayfair or leaving to go and work on open source projects, it's roughly the same.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Amanda.
Jump back and value. No, I was going to jump back and value. So PJ, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what, and thank you, Amanda. I agree with a lot of what Natalie's saying. Like, it's kind of the concept of community and open source go hand in hand, but that's not untrue about the product side either. Like, you need a community to support what you're doing. The beauty, in my mind, has always been the beauty of community to build open source. Like, it's an understanding that we're all consuming this thing, but we're all also adding and subtracting from it, because sometimes features go away and sometimes they get rebuilt, things get deprecated, things come back. But I like the idea. Like, it sounds like Wayfair has a similar idea, because I remember what it was like when we were at Crate, where someone can come in and say, hey, I'm having this issue, but let's discuss the issue first. Present to me all the issues you're having. Cool. There's actually a way to do that you're not seeing, because maybe you're not a power user or you're not as into the project as someone else. And we see this at Mattermost all the time, where someone comes in and says, hey, I want to build a plugin for my CrateDB information. Well, cool. We actually already have one. So let's close this PR and refer you to the other thing. And that's kind of the beauty of community and open source, is that you have your own support team built. It's of all of the other people who aren't the one person. And that one person is going to be the support for someone else. Without community, you can't have a successful open source project. Without community, you can't have a successful product. These things go hand in hand, and you have to treat them exactly the same way. And kind of everyone is welcome. No one should be excluded, except for, as Natalie pointed out, people that are like the gate crashers of this particular meeting. But luckily, there's tools out there. There's the contributor covenant that you can add to your project. That helped Mattermost out a lot, because we did have some toxic participators, and we were able to remove them because these are the rules, and the rules are clearly stated, and you're not following the rules. The same way that we have a code of conduct for this meetup that people are supposed to follow, and there's consequences like getting kicked out if you don't follow them. It's a very simple thing. Open source comes with rules. Projects come with rules. If you're going to participate, you need to be a good community citizen. And I think that communities together can band together to actually state, here's what it means to be a good community citizen. It's not going to be universal, but like I said, with the contributor covenant and other codes of conduct in repos, it does make it easier to say, this is a safe place, this is an inclusive place, this is a place where we all want to work together. So let's do that in a positive manner, instead of having something where it's, benevolent dictator for life. No, this is not the way it's going to go. This is my project. Please get out. That doesn't benefit anyone, and it certainly doesn't benefit the community.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree, and I think it's really important to have these contributions, be it even bug reports, because software is used the way it wasn't used before in testing by us. And on that, Per, I know you're really focused on security and risks that you take in with using open source software in your stacks. What is your view on that? How important is it to have this connection to the developers to can give back or work with them on problems you might experience?
So I think if we take the first part of the risk and how we look at that, we look at the community size around the projects we use. We look at the activity. We look at what is the diversity of the community that is actually involved in building these products. In the end, we don't want to depend on a single vendor, just having basically a single vendor software project. And we don't want to depend on this, because it's too easy to change, and we can also see changes in licensing done by a single vendor. So having a strong and diverse community around a project is actually a sign of maturity for us, and also therefore a risk reduction basic for us. That's how we look at it. Also, when a project is not driven by a single vendor, there's also a lot more openness to actually contribute from the outside. That means that we not coming in as a big enterprise demanding certain things as we would do with our commercial vendors. Here it's more the individual engineer who's involved with using or consuming this product can actually go and contribute to this. So we see Zalando contributions to these projects is typically driven by the individual team or the individual developer who depends on this, and not as something we as a company strategically decides to get involved in. Of course, we have bigger things where we highly depend on Postgres and we highly depend on Kubernetes, obviously, and we are involved there to a bigger extent. But it is still down on a team level and engineering level that the choice to contribute to these things is made. But yeah.
So just one another question on top of that. When you have this, of course, you have many open source projects that also have an enterprise offering. When do you think there's a decision between going from an open source software to an enterprise offering, be it managed or not managed? What makes this decision for you?
Yeah, I think this is where I have my own preference as an open source developer, and what we as a company has a preference for, because obviously from a risk perspective, if there is a managed offering of an open source project, it is less risky for us to go with an AWS offering here. And that is probably the unpopular answer, but that is unfortunately how it works right now, that if we can get a managed offering from AWS instead of downloading something ourselves, buying a license and running and managing this ourselves, then obviously the risk is reduced by using an AWS offering, because we can transfer the risk to them, basically. So that will always be the preference for an enterprise, basically. I don't say that's how it's supposed to be, but that's unfortunately the reality that everyone has to live with.
So
I think Amanda has something to add.
Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't click the button.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Exactly on that point, actually, I want to talk a bit about value and where we're seeing that going. So being long enough in the tooth to have looked at this about a decade ago, the way software companies, proprietary software companies, talked about their value was in total cost of ownership. And it was something that we found was heavily adopted in open source and works really well on-prem, doesn't work so well on the cloud, and is pretty outdated, but it's the way that valuation was traditionally done. Within Open UK, we've just published a report, and we're now looking at adoption, picking up on what Per said. That adoption's across industry now, and we want to see how much adoption there is so that we can start to look at value in a different way, and we can look at value as the outbound generated economics around open source. So when you're talking about AWS and the other cloud providers, how much of that is open, how many companies are using it, and how much are they generating from that at the other end? So the value generation piece is going to be really significant work, and we're going to see a lot of people working around it in the next year as we look at new ways to measure the value of open. And I think what Per is saying is absolutely right. Enterprise are always going to take the easier route to get the best solutions. And if that open source best solution is readily available, packaged up nicely in the cloud or platform economy, that's going to be attractive to them. But if you go back to the very first question when we were dealing with all the disruption that Georg asked us, he was asking about the legal stuff and how it all works and what was going on with Elastic. And my personal view is that we're going to see change, and we're not going to see change in the way Deloitte suggested, which is that we're going to change the open source definition of the licensing. And I don't think actually the public source, this third way that people are talking about, is going to be it. I don't see enough interest in going and building a new movement. I actually think what's going to happen is a fourth way. The folk that run these big cloud companies are smart. They know that this problem exists, that it's been very public, that their users are very aware of it. The enterprises understand that it might be legally okay on the licensing, but it doesn't feel fair. And the controversy around the shifts to SSPL and the like has really pushed it into the public glare. And I think what we're going to see is the competition authorities, the antitrust authorities understanding that. And if the cloud providers don't look at this vendor lockout of open source and lock in of the enterprise companies, which they don't like either. The big companies might like buying from the cloud, but they don't like the lack of interoperability or the lock-in. And I think we're going to see in 2021 the start of a shift. And I know in 2019, Google started to share revenue. AWS did it with Grafana in the run up to Christmas. That was very publicized, and I suspect that will be the start of a lot more. So I think we're going to see two things happening. We're going to see a shift in the way it's done from an enterprise and business perspective, and a bit more sharing there. And then I think we're going to see new ways of valuing and finding the economics around the open source companies, all of which should build us a healthier ecosystem, I hope.
Well, thank you. PJ, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's funny because we mentioned before when we met a couple of times about the panel before we got started, there was a concern that I was going to sit here and agree with Amanda with everything that she said. And I'm finding that it's true. I'm just going to sit here and agree with Amanda in everything she said. She's absolutely right. Like the speculations and the different things that are going on in the community right now, or it's hard to say community. It's such a ubiquitous word, but the way that the thought leaders of open source, if you will, and some of the not thought leaders who think they know about open source, the way all of these directions are pulling, I think that really that fourth option that Amanda mentioned is probably the way things are going to go, because it makes the most sense for the most people. And in that kind of attitude, that's kind of how open source has always been. In the perfect scenario, I mean, not all open source projects work that way. Not all open source companies work that way, but in the perfect scenario, it should be what benefits the community the most for everyone. And hopefully that's the direction that we move in.
Yeah, so I'll give it a try at a slight disagreement, which to keep this interesting. My only fear here, and here I think back to how for instance Firefox built up a huge dependency on Google for revenue, depending on like a single basically provider of cache info for their products. And here I could see like a similar concern that if we have all these open source businesses that end up depending on revenue from cloud providers, and in the public eye, open source basically becomes something you can buy at Amazon and not something you find in a project with a community and with people involved. And you basically put this abstraction in between the actual developers of the software and the consumers. Because I think that's one of the clear strengths of open source software, is that you have this direct connection between the developer and the consumer. So having these like parasites in between, and then of course paying their dues to these communities to kind of look better, I think is problematic. And I think that can maybe long-term be problematic for these projects, and we might lose relevance because we have this barrier in between us and the users. And we might also actually forget who we are actually serving. Are we serving the cloud companies to deliver profits to the shareholders, or are we actually building software to solve problems for people?
But what you are saying here is basically that if you really want that software that is universally used and has this universal community, not fixed to one cloud provider, not to one of the big cloud providers, then it would be a better solution to have offerings that are somewhat, maybe that feel like a cloud offering that AWS has or that Azure has, but still are open in the way that you could run it anywhere.
Yeah, I'm not really in the business of providing solutions here. I'm just saying I think what was clear when Firefox adopted a revenue stream for Google, they forgot to think about how they actually deliver value to the users. And I see the same risk here, that if we just get a constant stream from the cloud providers as revenue, we also get out of touch with why are we actually doing this? Where do we actually provide value? Either for the cloud providers or the end users. So I don't know what we should do instead. I certainly think it's fair that the cloud providers pay these projects, but there is the risk of forgetting who you actually serve here.
Good point. Amanda?
Yeah, I don't disagree at all with that, Per. I think what we'll see is that will be the next step, and that's what will happen with the revenue, and that will make that problem go away for a period of time. I don't think any of us are in a position to predict where that platform economy model is going to go, and it's just going to keep shifting and changing and adapting. But I think what is really clear is the way we value things at the moment is wrong. It's out of date, and that's not just for open source software. That's the same for almost anything across the digital economy. In particular, I was talking to an economist about this who works in the music sector, and it's got a similar shift. I know PJ likes this one, where they've gone from, say it's 10% of what is produced in music now is produced by the labels, 90% is produced by individuals. And software has made that same sort of shift where it's gone from the hands of the few to the hands of the many, but it's just going to keep evolving. There's just going to be more and more around that. I really find it interesting that we're now having a conversation about Firefox's revenue stream. From the various roles that I've had over the years as a lawyer, I understood how that worked on the click of your browser, but not many people did. And it really took the antitrust and competition authorities a long time to catch up with that, to be able to look at what's right and fair. And I think we're going to see a lot of shift. The EU are really intensely going after what they call high tech instead of big tech. And I think we're going to see a lot of shift in regulation, a lot of focus on things like Gaia X, trying to bring this back home. And I think Gaia X is a great example of where open source really comes into its own. Now, I don't know whether these guys will do it right or not. We have to wait and see. But with Gaia X, it's like many other things where you can only create it at the scale that you're creating it and at the pace because you're using open source. And those big infrastructure projects, those multi-company collaborations are to me absolutely brilliant for open source. At the same time, I'm being told, and I don't have any figures to back this, but I'm being told that there's a decrease in the single vendor producers. So again, maybe we're going to see a shift as the economics work themselves out. Good or bad, I don't know.
Well, thank you for that. All right. So I mean, thinking about, we see a lot of changes in these revenue streams, not only on open source, but I mean, there's this big lawsuits again between Apple and the store policies as well. Totally nothing to do with open source. But then again, a question in that regard also, and what happened just with Microsoft and the Exchange servers maybe. So do you dare have this quite closed source software? And on the one hand, and you have many different kind of closed source software, and on the other hand, you have these regulations that's coming more and more, be it a Protection Act towards the US, be it the GDPR regulations that we have now. How do you think those two things fit together? How do you think it is okay to trust another company fully on your data, and also especially with this cloud providers that you basically have no insight anymore what's happening behind the roles, and on the other hand, especially with this also retail focus that Natalie and Per, you both have. How do you think how do you think that fits together? So I think PJ raised his hand, so I'm happy to ask him as well.
I think it's an interesting thing. I just want to kind of make a note as we get into this is, you know, we have this, especially on the tech side, this idea of security and this idea of information and data and where it's shared and GDPR and what all of this means. And then there's an entirely whole other sector of people, I would say the majority of people on the planet, who think they're secure and don't think about it and go on Facebook and publish their social security number and, you know, share their phone number with the guy at the mall because they might get a free, you know, smoothie or something. Like we are so concerned in the tech sector with security that we completely ignore the fact that we're plugging the holes for like other things, for other applications or other pieces of software to get the information, but we're not in any way teaching the consumer how to actually better secure themselves. Like we talk about the Microsoft, you know, and I think a lot of us in open source, and especially a lot of us in modern tech, like, people using a Microsoft Exchange server, it's 2021. It's one of the most widely used pieces of software in the world. You know, I talked about this when I used to work for Crate. We talked about Crate. It's a great distributed database. You want to know the most widely used database in the world? Microsoft Access. I haven't thought about that since high school, but it's still the most widely used database in the world. We need to stop putting things in our own terms when we think about security, when we think about safety, when we think about data sharing, because what we end up doing is, you know, I'm sure that when Yahoo started out as an email service, they didn't say, you know, what we're going to do, we're totally going to sell people's information. That's how we're going to, that's our revenue model. But that's what they ended up doing. They realized that they could actually, they felt that they were doing something beneficial. We're creating this system where we can better deliver you the information you're looking for. Well, that's great, except in order to do that, you sold my information to, you know, Johnny used car salesman down the street. I don't need a used car. I was just looking at used cars once. So I think that that's something we need to take into consideration when this conversation happens, especially because whenever you have these at the big enterprisey conferences or these discussions with big enterprise groups, they're always like, well, open source is insecure. And it's like anything's about as secure as you make it.
Well, thanks for that. So we're nearing the end of our hour. Originally, it was planned to be open for questions from the viewers. I think we can skip that today. What I would like to do, and I'm really, really sorry for all the troubles in the beginning. I think we have your contributions today were really awesome, and I really hope to see you sometime again and talk to us sometime again. I would like just to give you, just the last minutes of maybe for each of you, where do you see the future of OSS and what your role will be in that. Please keep it short that we can all, just finish in time. But yeah, so maybe who wants to start? Yeah, you are unmuted already.
Okay, then I can start. So where's open source going? I think this is one of the things that's not going to go away. I think if I look inside of Zalando, the expectation is open source. This is the default. It's actually, people would object if we didn't go the open source way, and that's the expectation from engineers, from project managers, from management as well. This is the new normal for most tech companies. That this is the way you're going to go. We still have ways to go on how we manage the risk of open source, how we manage the commercial models in these, and how do we properly support these projects also as an enterprise, also as Zalando. How do we support these projects to ensure that they are also financially supported, not just on the side of code contribution. So my hope is that we as bigger enterprises become better at this over the next years, so we can continue supporting this and these projects can become sustainable without going the VC route or without becoming a foundation. I think there must be other and better ways for these projects to survive.
Thanks. So may I ask Amanda to go next?
Thanks very well for moderating us in this. It's not the easiest circumstances. You've done a good job. I think that open source now is pretty much like gravity, right? It's all around us. There's no point in finding it. We've got to flow with it. We've got to work with it. It's a very special thing that needs to be protected. And that's something I worry about because we have to understand what it means, how it works. We need to do more on the governance and the risk side, as Per says. And we see projects like SPDX and OpenChain creating standards that will help enterprise to do that. I think it's really important that we think about the skill sets for the future, not just teaching people to use Python or Java or whatever it is, but also understanding why it's open and what that means, and the care that they have to take in things like selecting a license and making sure they're contributing properly. For me, what I'm going to do for the foreseeable future, at least, I'm going to be here in the UK trying to make it a better place to do open in. We've been a bit modest in the past, and we're, I think, the 4th or 5th biggest contributor in the world. And we're going to take our place at the table and try and do more here to support the growth, not just here, but everywhere.
Thank you. Sounds really awesome. And looking forward to that and looking forward to, maybe next, Natalie.
Yeah, for sure. Wayfair is definitely at the start of where it wants to get to, which is similar to what Per described, which is that open is the base standard for sure. And that's something that we've now come to realize that is something that we've used a lot of, and now it's time to actually give back because of the further great benefits that'll actually see for us in many different ways. And so I definitely see my role specifically in this journey for Wayfair and eventually in perhaps other companies as being very educative in terms of getting everyone on board with how that actually works, kind of working myself out of a job, because once everyone knows how to do it, that job then it actually changes. And so I definitely try and address that with with an auxiliary engineering model, embedding with teams, showing them how to actually work in the open, how that actually will affect their work and their own contributions in future. And then hopefully that multiplies. And so my role, I definitely see as probably in a couple of years, I'm out of a job and I have to think about something else to do at this company because everyone has learned how to do open source. But at the same time, I think then what happens there is that education then turns into advocacy, and it's the idea about advocating for open, advocating for why it's worth actually being very openly communicative and not just jumping on the side with your teammate over there on Slack to quickly discuss a problem, but to openly have that dialogue in the open, and the community is seeing how you're thinking and how you're working. That for me is actually a super exciting place that I see open going, where outside of the fun times of asking someone to be a bit more specific in their bug that they're publishing because they can't use this service anymore, we're now going to stop using it if you're asking me for more information. Hopefully that actually changes now to more communication, more actual people wanting to engage with open as opposed to just expecting it to give something to them. And then I see that as something that is a long-term job for me, likely.
This sounds great. Thank you. Yeah. And last, we are already short on time. PJ, please, what is your view on the future of
Sure. I'll try to be brief, and also I talk fast anyway. So I think it's interesting. Like I started getting involved in open source in the 90s when it started to become a thing. And if you look at it from then till now, we've seen tremendous growth. If you had asked me in 2000 or the 2010s, would Microsoft be an open source company? No, of course not. But they are now. They've embraced open source. IBM bought Red Hat specifically because they didn't have a good open source strategy, and Red Hat did. So they're still using kind of the old ancient dinosauric ways of looking at open source, which is if you can't build it, buy it. But at the same time, like it's pushing open source further and further ahead. I'd like to think that at some point in time, people will start to get the idea behind why the internet is and how it was built, which is the idea was to have a free and open platform. We should be able to build software that is free. We shouldn't have to worry about always profiting from it or always having to have VC backing to get it. If we can build tools and build things that will actually help people and help consumers to get what they need, whether that's, to buy a book off of Amazon, which, some of you young folks might not know, Amazon was a bookstore. That was the whole point, to buy your college books through Amazon. Or whether it's, to find a piece of software you never even understood. I think, if we look at things like the maker space and the 3D printing space where people are buying and they're not purchasing anything, but they can go and find designs, they can find things they need and build them by themselves at home. That's a huge leap forward in the way that open source should work. And I think if we're looking, 10, 15, 20 years into the future, that's the way I would like it to go. That's the way I hope that it will go. That will kind of do away with these, evil big corporations always controlling everything. And the community will be able to control open source and build the things they want and need, not have to worry about profit.
It sounds like a good future, yeah. Like a future to look forward to.
It's hopeful. It's a hopeful future.
Yeah. Obviously, yeah. Again, thanks to all of you. And I hear Simon already jumped in again. Thanks again, and hope to see you again at another event.
Well, thank you so much, speakers. That was awesome, and especially when you just said, it wouldn't be great to have a software company without having to figure out how to get venture funding and actually build something great. Without that, please come to me and let me know. I'm going to be the first one doing this. But no, thank you so much. It was really awesome and inspiring to hear the future of open source. And I'm glad that we had Crate on the track as well, and a part of that community completely and fully now. It was really inspiring, and thank you so much.